they set out. Now, the night was warm. It was wet. It was July 1st, and in those parts of the world, we all know what July 1st feels like. Humid. Moist. It was before midnight. Darkness was festooned across the land. Now, there were a few causeways still unmolested by Mexican self-vandalism. Now, the closest to these, if you look on the map, is the Tlacopan Causeway. And the Tlacopan Causeway is the one that extends straight across. Very short. It's the fastest way to the mainland from the heart of Tenochtitlan. Luckily for the Spaniards, as they walked and walked and walked, a driving rain covered any sounds they might have made. But regardless of the rain, even nature knew to be quiet on that night. Not even a horse whinnied or a water bird croaked as the column silently snaked its way through the city, which lay apparently sleeping and still. A city that was unaware that their enemy, that they longed to have hearts from, was slipping away. The Spaniards moved very calmly. They could see the Tlacopan Causeway just a few steps ahead, and they reached it successfully. The portable bridge connected properly after being put in place, and the column began safely crossing. Very safely. Cortez himself crossed with the leading companies and most of the cavalry. The middle of the column then started progressing, and as the men moved on as still and quietly as they could, they heard a shout, and then another shout, and then a torrent of shouts accompanied by whistles and pipings and callings from all around them, as if the water was rising with many beasts and monsters. They could hear the whoosh of oars and of the water seething. The roofs themselves were alive, and lights all around them from torches seemed to be clustered to the causeways and bridges, all the adjacent land masses. Mexico had woken up. Now, it could have been by some dark magic. They did not know. They'd been as quiet as possible. What could have gone wrong? What possibly could have woken these people up or alerted to them of their presence? And before they knew it, the black waters of the lake and the sounds they were making were soon made visibly apparent, as they couldn't even see the water anymore. The water's thick with canoes, and on those canoes, Mexico's most elite infantry units, the Eagle Warriors, child soldiers who had worked a long time, now adults who had killed many men, big and strong and terrible, decked out in feathers and with long flint or jade swords. And as the Spaniards see this, and as the noise overwhelms any officer's shout, they're filled with a terrible panic that fuels a hurry. And here they now are, some on the causeway, some on extendable portable bridge, and some in the rear guard haven't even crossed both. They haven't even loaded onto both. They're strung out. They can't reinforce the other. The flying brigade that was there, 100 men strong, they can't help any part that is featuring any heavy attack. Everyone is about to be swarmed upon, and from their learning of the Mexican tongue, they can hear amongst the tangle of shouts and garbled words the yells of the Mexicans. Cut them off! Leave none alive! The rain grew steadier. Commands are misheard. Horses slipped and slipped in the pooling water, and men grunted and cursed and tugged at their animals and friends while they slipped, while all around them the lake and the canoes on the lake gathered and speedily drew near and nearer and nearer. Some of the captains on their horses, they see this and they spurred their men across, getting them to move, picking up the slack, trying to move forward. But it was too late. They were a rabbit, and they had been caught in the snare. Mexican warriors, citizens, even women and children gleefully emerged from the shadows around Tenochtitlan and by the entrance of the portable bridge. And while the eagle warriors sprang from canoes onto the bridge, onto the causeway, the rear guard was beset by all the citizenry of Mexico. Now this crowd of citizens smashed into the rain-soaked defenders with some kind of devilish fury. And before you know it, the poor defenders found themselves overwhelmed. The Spanish could not aid each other, and as Mexico itself endeavored to break or tear away the portable bridge and kill all they could, those on the causeway, seeing them suffer, found themselves beset by a litany of evils. They could not cross anywhere. They had to keep pushing ahead, and they were fighting for their lives against a foe that brutally and gleefully savaged their bodies. With flint swords and spears, they swung and hit the Spaniards. Men were dragged from the crossings into the water. They had their throats slit, and oftentimes, right there on the spot, their heart was ripped from their chest in the process. Cannons fell crashing into the lake, their men overwhelmed by terror. Slings concussed the heads of the companies. Many of these hit plummeted into the lake unconscious, dazed, drowning with no one to save them. Volleys of arrows came falling from the sky, from some place invisible, from some place where musketeers could not return fire. And these arrows killed indiscriminately, Spaniard and Mexican alike. The rain was now pooling. It had only been a few minutes of attack, but the rain was pooling, mixing with the blood that was everywhere, and disaster, as it always does in these situations, followed disaster. There was no running from this fighting. Every Spaniard, every Tlaxcalan was killed or being killed, killing, dying. The battle was ferocious. The rain increased even harder, if that even could have happened, and more horses fell from the portable bridge into the lake, throwing their screaming riders with them. In this terrible din and fury and chaos, Cortez and his few men struggled to the opposite side of the bridge, only to find the eagle warriors had jumped from their canoes there in such numbers that in spite of valiant effort they could not escape that way. They could not dislodge them. No one, they thought, would escape that night. It was as if the angel of death had visited them, and now their souls were for the reaping. But Cortez was steady on, and he directed his men with a bellowing voice, as many as he could, to go straight towards the causeway, out towards Tacuba, towards the mainland. And as he headed towards the causeway in the proper direction, he ran right into the mouth of an army of Mexicans, and they were shouting, and they were screaming. "Villains!" they shouted. "Why are you still alive?" Cortez heard this, and his Spaniards did not respond. It was pure adrenaline. They were suffering from wounds left and right, many of them, but with swords in their hands, they flung themselves at the Mexican army, blocking their path, hacking and slicing them down, until, well, it can only be described as beef jerky everywhere, tangled meat. And as they were wounded many times, and as many were killed along their own party, they managed to berserk their way through the causeway, and Cortez and his nearby captains and men found themselves the only men alive in that portion, and they reached the dry land. These men, for the moment, had saved their lives, and many collapsed on all fours from sheer exhaustion, their eyes blurry, their voices hoarse, and their eardrums buzzing. It was chaos, it was hell, and in the first few moments of safety, all seemed to have forgotten the rest of the column. Where were the others? After all, everyone had entered primordial mode. Kill or be killed, escape or die. These few had escaped. They had some horses with them, and they had some gold. Plenty of Tlaxcalans in their party had survived as well. They had proved invaluable. But what of the other captains? What of Juan Velazquez and Pedro de Alvarado in the rear? Where were they? Most of Cortez's men, even Cortez himself, were only thinking about their present predicament. They knew everyone in the back would die. They did not have the muskets or the crossbows to even launch a counterattack. They'd all been lost in the bridge. And it was night. Everyone's hurt. and to return to the causeway and the bridge meant death, certain death. On one side of the water there had always been canoes, and interspersed throughout there had been low-lying roofs, which the Mexicans had hurled death from above with safety. The only reason that Cortez's men had not died that night was because of Cortez's strength of character, his sterling bravery, and the bravery of his men. He had dragged his bedraggled forces to safety, and they had made it. But only because the Mexicans were hell-bent on slaughtering the rest of the column that was left behind. Now, we don't know too much of the rest of this column, for most of them didn't make it. My notes only cover the men that were with Cortez and the babblings of a few wild and crazy wounded men. But what we do know is that some of the company wanted to head on towards the relative safety of the inland town of Tacuba. Inland, I mean, relative to the lake. While some wanted to go to safety, some wanted to return. They started seeing from their makeshift camp that they had set up that there were bits and bits of wounded men, Spaniards starting to emerge from across the causeway. Just bits, not much. Companies that had 25, 50, 75 men now only had less than a dozen. Men were still alive back there, they said, and they could not be left to die. The wounded survivors, they shouted, please save our friends. Don't run. Don't leave us. Go back there. Save them. And the lower and middle rear guard that was there had been fighting without hope now for many, many minutes. They had been fighting without even hope of survival. The bodies of hundreds and hundreds of dying Spaniards were everywhere. Their Tlaxcalan allies, too, more so. In their armored despair, each individual Spaniard in the rear and lower guards, under Pedro de Alvarado and Juan Velazquez, they were like a cornered wolf, bitterly biting any Aztec that drew near. But just like a wolf can be killed from a distance, so these Spaniards were as well, victims of stones, victims of bows and arrows, victims of javelins or long lances, or merely overwhelmed by massive numbers. They were a fearsome foe for the Mexicans, and they killed many with them. But as the more and more of them died, the less and less of them there were to fight their way across the causeway. Try to picture it now. The rear guard abandoned, not knowing where their friends are, not knowing if Cortez is alive, not knowing if this will be the end result of all of their tribulations. They're attacked by the water, by canoes. The causeway ahead's blocked. Everything on all sides, rooftops near the water, on the water. Talent doesn't save you here. It's raw adrenaline. It's raw adrenaline and chance. Many men had been wounded multiple times. You're probably wondering what happened to the gold-laden followers of Panfilo Narvaez. They were dying in droves. They had been loaded down with so much gold that in the chaos and panic and in their wounds and in their slipping, many had fallen into the reddening lake, and most of them drowned, if not being captured and immediately sacrificed. Cortez could see the remnants of the once full companies straggling into his makeshift camp that he had made near the small village. And seeing this, he rushed back with all men on horse and foot who were capable of walking at that moment. He had to save as many as he could, and he didn't have to go far to see all that was left. For all that was left of the lower, middle, and rear guard was a bleeding out Pedro de Alvarado, leaning on a captured Aztec spear as a crutch. His horse had been killed. With him was a sorry sight of those hundreds back there, including hundreds of Indians. There were only 4 badly wounded Spaniards with him and 8 Tlaxcalans. That's all there was. And these were marked with arrows and had terrible gashes and abrasions on them. And they collapsed instantly, many of them thanking and praising God, and the Tlaxcalans themselves clutched each other. They had been a few number indeed. for it is reported that thousands of Tlascalans died, or upwards of 1,500. Cortez wanted to carry them away for medical attention, but he waited several minutes, peering through the gloom past midnight to see if anyone else would come, to see if there were any more survivors. But all he could hear were the shouts of a celebrating Mexican army and citizenry. No one came through the darkness. Pedro was the last one. That was all that could save itself from the terrible carnage. And at the sight of his friend in such a condition, and of his friends dead and wounded, and the slaughter of so many good soldiers, Cortez burst into tears. He wept. He wept, I should say, for Pedro. And Pedro retold the events of what had happened. He was badly hurt and bleeding, but he was going to survive, and from his lips he delivered a tale of horror unlike any heard of before in the New World. The rear guard that fought with its last ounce of strength, well, none the braver in that rear guard was Juan Velasquez, who after slaying many Mexicans was struck down dead at the bridge, along with 80 other Spaniards. Throughout their journey they had lost many more. Only he and his 4 Spaniards and 8 Tlascalans had cut their way through to safety, while the Mexicans were distracted with celebrating and killing or sacrificing wounded prisoners or looting the corpses. He and his men had walked over many dead horses and boxes and the corpses of friends. It's hard to see, your best friends, comrades, people you traveled with, gotten to know for so long, like family, just seeing them dead now. And that was most of them. In fact, on several detour bridges across the water and at several points in the main causeway, the passages were impassable due to them being choked with the fallen bodies of horses, Spaniard and Aztec, or Tlascalan. In the end, he had to jump from a big pile of bodies into the water and then onto another bridge to avoid the searching Mexicans. But he and his men, what was left of them, made it. While Cortez wept and then returned with all that was left of his other captains, his advance camp had found safety in the temple square of Tacuba, not that far away. The Mexicans, meanwhile, had been waiting for them, though. They had been waiting for any survivors, and they began harassing those they could, trying to pick off and drag any weak ones, throwing stones, shooting arrows, and the wounded just became more wounded. If you could become more miserable than these men became more miserable, count on that. The Spaniards that were there had to counterattack a few times. So amazing that they had any strength left in their bodies, and they did drive them away, although they lost 3 of their men who were captured and whose screams could be heard and then snuffed out. But there were more Mexicans gathering. So when Cortez finally caught up to the place where they were, everyone quickly left, ASAP, as quickly as they could, and they followed the path that 5 trustworthy Tlascalans set them out on. This path would avoid the main road back to Tlaxcala, but would cut through the countryside. It would be dangerous. They would still be followed. The path would be sometimes impassable. But if they took the main road, they would surely be surrounded and killed. Throughout this flight from the shore, through the countryside, through the brambles and trees, the Mexicans followed them with arrows, with shouts and jeers, javelins and stones, insults and crudities, and they surged about the much bloodied and disfigured and smaller column many times, in fact, so many times that the Spaniards lost count. Finally, they reached some houses on a hill, where some kind of fortified pyramid stood, like a fort almost. It was a good place to rest, to hole up for a bit. They had to. They could not go on anymore.